Welcome students to this course on American literature. In today's class, we will begin our lectures on one of the most seminal novels in American literature, titled The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, written by Mark Twain. Before we go into an analysis of the novel itself, let us look at the life of the author, Mark Twain himself. Mark Twain's real name was Samuel Longhorn Clemens, and he was born somewhere in the early 19th century in 1835 and lived right up to the beginning of the 20th century and died in 1910. Mark Twain was a pseudonym that Samuel Clemens used for his work as a novelist. Samuel Clemens was a man of many talents. He was a swimmer, he was a seaman, he was also a painter and a soldier. His experience in all these vivid spheres of life is clearly reflected in his works, in his two most important works, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The pseudonym Mark Twain here is a reference to his background in being a seaman. Mark Twain is a nautical expression which signifies the depth of the water. It literally means the depth of the water is 12 feet. It has an interesting significance as far as the notion of seamanship is concerned. Mark Twain, or the depth of 12 feet, is referred to as the dividing line which demarcates the safe and dangerous shallow water throughout which a ship can safely sail. The pseudonym here and the choice of the depth of water, and especially its significance, has important philosophical connotations. Perhaps what the author here is implicitly trying to refer to is that he, as an author, as a writer of fiction, as a creator of new worlds, lives and dwells between these two different worlds of something being safe, something being dangerous, and something being real. These are the two worlds between which the author has to constantly keep shifting from and back into his real world. Another important aspect of American literature, especially American literature written in the post-Civil War period, is the history of slavery and the implications that slavery had in American society. Anyone who has a basic understanding of history would know that the slaves were brought from the African continent into Europe and America so that they could work as a source of free labor to work in the plantations in the American South. The American South was predominantly known for agriculture, and they cultivated primarily cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane. Slavery brought with itself great deals of injustice, and it was a human tragedy that unfolded for at least more than 2 centuries in America. The Civil War, which was fought from the year 1861 to 1865, was fought between the northern and southern parts on the issue of state rights and abolition of slavery. The Civil War ultimately led to the defeat of the South, and it had two important implications. The victory of the North over the South consolidated the power of the Union over the southern states, and therefore the autonomy and the independence that the southern states enjoyed in the pre-Civil War period ceased to exist post the Civil War. And therefore came about the United States of America, a union which held sway administratively over all the states, where the states as individual entities had some significant individual rights, not at the cost of the integrity of the entire country. The second most implication of the Civil War was the abolition of slavery by the 13th Constitutional Amendment in 1865. It was only after more than a century of repression and injustice that this law was legally enshrined into the American Constitution and slavery was finally abolished. The abolition of slavery was followed by a Reconstruction program for the South, which was initiated as an attempt to correct, rectify, and perhaps help the South recover from the economic and social and material losses that they suffered because of the Civil War. The aim of the Reconstruction program was twofold: the economic recovery of the South, while simultaneously ensuring that the emancipation of the Negroes was sustained and they were allowed to exercise their social and political freedom. The Reconstruction program unfortunately collapsed in the year 1877. This led to the negation of freedoms won by the former slaves. Because the federal troops or the central government troops, which were responsible for ensuring law and order in the South, were recalled by the federal government or the central government, as we would call it in India. And therefore, due to the lack of any surveillance by the central government in America, things went back to how they were before the Civil War period. The former slaves who were legally free, unfortunately in reality, had to continue living as slaves and were constantly at the mercy of their former slave owners. Not only did it not negate the horrible effects of slavery, but in fact, in some sense, it exacerbated it. Because the segregation of blacks and whites continued and in fact was intensified and legalized under the Jim Crow laws, as they were called in America. The segregation of the black and white races continued right up to the 1950s until the civil rights movement started by Dr. Martin Luther King. In order to understand the social, economic and political setting of the novels of Mark Twain, it is important to understand the after effects that America had to witness post the Civil War. There were some phenomenal changes that America had to witness after the Civil War because of the defeat of the South and the ascendancy and domination of the North. The defeat of the South entailed a defeat of feudal notions, a defeat of agrarian societies, and a defeat of a backward-looking slave-owning society. A victory of the North, on the other hand, suggested a victory of modernity, a victory of science, a victory of industrialization and modernization. And therefore, the post-Civil War era was an era of industrialization in America. Industrialization in steel, industrialization in cement, in construction, in manufacturing is what led to great prosperity in the American cities, especially in the cities of the North. Since industrialization led to prosperity and in some sense a concentration of population in urban centers around the factories and corporations, it also led to rapid urbanization. Rapid urbanization would mean an increased number of cities that were being born and being created in the post-Civil War period. Cities were required in order to host the population of working class people that were settling down to work in the factories, to work as middle class servicemen and as the aristocratic or the upper middle class people who ran these businesses. Since the urban cities provided great sources of employment, there was an obvious increase in the population of America. Not only was there a concentration in the population of cities, but there was also an overall increase in the population of the American continent because of a great extent of immigration in the American continent from Europe and the rest of the world, because of the great number of opportunities that the land of America offered to everyone who was willing to work hard. Unfortunately, it led to some negative consequences as well. The domination of urban cities and the domination of corporations led to an establishment of a many number of oligarchies in businesses. What do we mean by the word oligarchies? Oligarchies would be the supremacy or the domination of a few individuals who own businesses and corporations. Therefore, they directly and indirectly affect the political and economic establishment of the countries that they live in. The American politics was greatly influenced by these oligarchs who masqueraded as businessmen while simultaneously influencing the politics of the country. As the corporations grew because of the fertile economic environment provided by the American cities, there was also felt a need for unionization of workers, which was obviously not favored by the businesses, since unionization of workers would have meant an increased wages and less hours of work, leading to a depression of profits for the businesses. Hence, the conflict of interest between the businesses and the unionization of workers led to great amount of violent conflicts in the latter half of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Despite all these economic developments, unfortunately, the racist attitudes in the American cities and even in the American South continued unabated. Some of the laws were strengthened, laws of anti-miscegenation were brought about, which would mean that an interracial marriage or union between a black individual and a white individual was considered illegal in the eyes of the law. America grew increasingly comfortable with the idea that even though the races had to coexist, they had to live in some sense legally and socially separately. Coming back to the novel of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the novel created a wide array of responses when it was published. Some, like Hemingway, hailed it as the source of all modern American literature. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn represented a watershed moment in the sense that it was one of the earliest novels which represented a white and a black character going on to a journey together and more or less completing the journey in a very cordial fashion. Nevertheless, it was also criticized for being coarse and uncouth, since the language that was used by Mark Twain in the novel is not the standard English that one generally encounters in novels deemed to be great. The kind of language that Mark Twain used was very close to the dialect, the local dialect, the colloquial language that was used by many of the poor whites in the South and also by many of the African Americans who were in those times referred to as Negroes or niggers, which was a racist epithet which was used commonly for African Americans. Initially, it was seen as anti-racist for showing the escape of a black slave. In some sense, Mark Twain's novel was perhaps seen as a cry for an anti-racist attitude to be established in society. Mark Twain's own background and hatred of slavery was seen as a fuel adding to the fire that was the abolitionist movement, which was against slavery in America. In recent times, however, this notion of the novel being an anti-racist narrative has changed. The most important reason perhaps for this change in tenor of receiving the novel is behind the constant use of racist epithets like the word nigger that are strewn across the novel. One has to be mindful of the fact that the novel needs to be situated in the times in which it was written and published, which is the year 1885. In the year 1885, the word nigger was not necessarily just a racist epithet, but was also a descriptive term for African Americans. Although the way in which the word is seen today has completely changed, we need to keep this in mind while analyzing the novel and situate it in the context in which it was written. Now let's move to the setting of the novel itself. The novel is published in the year 1885, almost 2 decades after the Civil War ended. The incidents in the novel are set in the years preceding the Civil War. They are set in the area in Missouri, near the Mississippi River, and in the sequential sense, in the narrative sense, it is a sequel to his preceding novel, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. The novel continues from the point where The Adventures of Tom Sawyer left off, which is where Tom and Huck, two friends, Tom being the eponymous character of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huck being the eponymous character of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. These two friends, they find a stash of gold which was left by the robbers that they had managed to get convicted. And therefore, the preceding novel, which is The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, leaves both of them being completely enriched by this sudden strike of luck that they managed to come across. Let's very briefly look at the summary and revise what the entire narrative is about. Huck, at this point, despite the new riches that he's found, is living with a woman called Widow Douglas and her sister, Miss Watson. The women try everything possible to instill in Huck a life of discipline and religiosity. They want Huck to become an antithesis of what he is already, someone who is uncouth, unhygienic, and almost irreligious and irreverent. Huck unfortunately has an alcoholic father who, in an attempt to snatch the money that Huck has earned, kidnaps him and wants to steal his money and later hides him in the cabin near the Mississippi River. Huck fortunately manages to escape by feigning his own murder, and he finds the company of Jim, who is a runaway slave owned by Miss Douglas. And this company and this duo is what then moves on to the adventures that they come across when they find a raft on the Mississippi River and continue on to their adventures throughout the novel. Huck and Jim manage to get on a raft that they find on the Mississippi when it gets flooded. The raft that they find is from a house that has been completely leveled and destroyed because of the flood. During the journey, Huck learns that there is a reward for letting the owner know about the whereabouts of Jim, and that in some sense is one of the most important moral dilemmas that Huck has to go through and resolve as his own individual development. As they move towards the free states being the states in the north where slavery has been abolished and the runaway slaves find a place of refuge. Remember, this is the period before the Civil War, hence slavery has not yet been legally abolished. As they are moving towards the free states, unfortunately they meet with an accident and get separated. Later, after being united, they meet two con men pretending to be royalty. The two con men being people who constantly fool others and loot others of their money. The con men ultimately do the worst possible act and they try to sell Jim to a farmer who ends up being Tom's uncle. And the story finally is resolved in Jim being freed and Huck planning to go on a journey of individual discovery towards the American West. Let's do a character analysis before we jump into the detailed narrative and thematic analysis of the novel itself. Let's begin with our protagonist, Huckleberry Finn himself. Huck is the fulcrum around which the entire narrative of the novel revolves. He belongs to the lowest strata of white society. Although he is not a slave, in some sense he resembles the company that he is in, which is that of Jim's company. He has an alcoholic father and is poor and homeless. His upbringing has separated him psychologically from mainstream society. He has no familial affection. He has no idea of a home. He is not settled anywhere and he has absolutely no religious background in which he finds himself rooted. He personifies the conflict of worldly morals with personal values. The worldly morals around him tell him that Jim is a slave who needs to be returned to his rightful owner, despite the fact that he is himself a human being and would have perhaps been separated from his family if he had continued being a slave. The character of Huck is not romanticized just because he is a 13-year-old boy, but he is fallible, imperfect, and goes through a sense of personal journey and development throughout the narrative of the novel. Jim, on the other hand, is one of the most important characters in the history of American literature as far as representation of a runaway slave is concerned. Jim is not the incoherent, mute, and bamboozling buffoon that one generally encounters in the American representations of slaves in the years gone by. He is resourceful, intelligent, kind, and compassionate. He has strong paternal and familial instincts. He not only cares about his own family, but he also cares deeply for Huck himself. He prevents Huck from seeing the dead body of the man who was in the house which was destroyed by the flood. That is a great example of how Jim wants to protect Huck from the harsh realities that they come across throughout their journey. Jim also is perhaps the only responsible adult in the novel and perhaps the only character who comes to being the closest paternal father figure that Huck has in his entire life that he has lived so far. Jim's character has been criticized by later critics for being too passive, for not being a rebel, for not being a revolutionary for his cause of freedom. But one needs to understand that Jim was a character who was a runaway slave and his circumstances dictated that he was at the mercy of those around him, especially those white men and especially Huck, who was in some sense largely sympathetic to Jim in comparison to those white people who were constantly on the hunt for Jim and return him to his original surroundings. And therefore, his passivity is to a great degree not only understandable but also justifiable. Tom Sawyer, Huck's friend, is in some sense the opposite of Huck. He is someone who has lived in a relatively middle class family and he has enjoyed the comfort of being in a middle class household. And therefore, his beliefs as well reflect a mixture of what adults believe and what he's read in the adventure books that he comes across. His mind is very malleable, and therefore he clearly represents what the adults around him think, and his attitude and behavior towards Jim is largely influenced by what he has seen the adults around him behave. He is someone who is generally in favor of authority and rules, and therefore is in some sense an oppositional character to that of Huck, because Huck is someone who is constantly trying to break the rules and defy authority. Tom, in sharp contrast to Huck, is largely unsympathetic to the woes and problems of Jim, because he simply does not relate to the problems that Jim faces, because he is a black man and also a runaway slave. Duke and Dauphin, the two conmen that Huck and Jim meet, in some sense metaphorically, figuratively represent greed, corruption and fraudulence, which was rampant in American society in the 19th century. As a technical device, they further the plot and provide another adventure for the protagonist to go on. They are much more of a severe reflection of Tom's proclivity to fraudulence and pretense. They are a much more intensified version of Tom's latent tendencies. And finally, the character of Pap, Huck's father. Pap, as a narrative tool, jumpstarts the action of the plot. By attempting to kidnap Huck and steal his money from him, he forces Huck's hand in order to escape not just from his father but also from his caretaker, and then go on to a journey of self-discovery with Jim is what drives the entire novel and provides us the content of the entire narrative tract. Both Widow Douglas and Pap in some sense represent the two extremes of the same spectrum of authority that Huck despises. They are both in some sense attempting to control individual freedom while at the same time stifle his own individual instincts and mold Huck according to what they think is the right way for an individual to grow. While Widow Douglas is only interested in making Huck a disciplined religious figure, Pap is only interested in Huck as a source of quick cash that he can make and then abandon him as he moves on from one alcoholism to the other. This brings us to the end of the first lecture. In the next class, we will go into a detailed analysis of the dialect, the narrative, and the thematic concerns that the novel Huckleberry Finn deals with. Thank you.